Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Artex Academy webinar. This is How to Optimize Resting Behavior with Dr. Nigel Cook from the Dairyland Initiative. We're going to start off with a short video, but before we do that, I just want to run through some details. You can ask your questions through the question and answer section that's located at the bottom of your screen. We will answer these towards the end, or you can feel free to put a message into the webinar chat. I will turn it over to Dr. Cook. If you could just run the video quickly.
Welcome to Plymouth Dairy Farms and Perry Creek Dairy. We are located in Plymouth County in northwest Iowa. We're currently milking at Plymouth Dairy Farms about 2,700 cows, and at Perry Creek almost 3,000 cows, so a total of almost 5,600 cows 3 times a day.
We added a second farm, Perry Creek Dairy, because we had a lot of animals, had some great guys looking for challenges. All that kind of came together a couple years ago and decided to take on the challenge of a second site.
We sat down with Sioux Dairy and a number of vendors to develop a plan and a strategy of where we wanted to put the dairy, how we wanted the dairy to look.
We took a lot of tours, drove around, looked at other guys' facilities, sites, what they liked, what they didn't like, put everyone's ideas into what we thought would work well here in Iowa. We came up with a tunnel ventilated barn on a carousel.
A word that we kept using during the design of this whole process was Taj Mahal of cow comfort. Everything from the free stalls to the headlocks to just cows being cows.
Firehelm family wanted to be able to milk high-producing Holstein cows. And with the heat of the summertime, we didn't want to have any heat stress. And that's what led to the tunnel ventilation concept versus a traditional cross-ventilated concept in a wide barn.
In the initial stages, Sioux Dairy and the Firehelm family approached us about the optimum way to ventilate this facility. Their concerns were fresh air. Their concerns were air movement through the cow space, getting the right air speeds for cow cooling. We wanted to make sure we had the best environment possible for those cows to be high production cows.
One of the things that we've always felt like was a strong suit from Artex is their ability to meet a customer's specific needs or a need that we had in a barn design. From custom parts to individual ventilation designs, Artex has always been able to help us work through those challenges.
The level of professionalism and details provided by Artex has really helped our projects. The Artex equipment has been a high quality and from an installation standpoint has gone together really well.
The crew we had that installed the headlocks, the gates, the free stalls, I was actually shocked at how fast they went. Once they got their pattern down, they just rolled.
Everyone worked well together. Sioux Dairy, Artex, and all the other vendors did a great job throughout the whole process. So we're extremely happy with how the process went.
Cows adapted well to the facility. From the startup, it's been going really well. Very happy with how the whole project went.
Wow, cool video and a great way to start this presentation, talking about optimizing resting behavior to enhance longevity in our dairy cows. I'm Nigel Cook. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here and to be invited to do, I think this is my third one of these for Artex. So I'll get on with it. I guess we all think we know what good cow comfort looks like. And I'm here to maybe add some question about that. Maybe I'm going to throw a few wrinkles in our current understanding because we're currently drowning in a lot of data on our farms. Now we're starting to get line time data, lying bouts, number of bouts per day, all this kind of information. And I'm not sure we fully know what to do with it. And hopefully this session will help you a little bit understand cow behavior and work out how we can optimize resting behavior. So the pillars of cow comfort, what are we talking about there? Well, we're talking about shelter from climate extremes. We're talking about the ability to feed and drink, to walk and exercise. But my predominant focus, and I think the majority of what we understand about good cow comfort, relates to this concept of optimized resting behavior. And that in itself will include adequate sleep, and cows do sleep just for a few hours a day, but it's very important to them to be able to sleep. But in this talk, we're going to focus on that optimal resting behavior, which is a sum of lying time, the number of times the cow lies down per day before she gets up and moves around, so the number of lying bouts, and then the duration of each of those bouts. And I kind of like the definition that I found in Webster of cow comfort, or comfort being contented well-being. I kind of like that term as it applies to the dairy cow. There have been a number of studies over the years looking at the effect on cattle of depriving them of the ability to lie down. So they have a number of different ways of doing that. But these studies are basically depriving cows of resting for, in many cases, almost the duration of an entire day. And we see with that some behavioral changes. Cows show leg stomping, weight shifting, head swinging, really signs of frustration, standing without rumination. But there's also some physiological changes that occur when cows don't get adequate rest. Stress hormones are affected, and most recently, we're starting to identify pro-inflammatory cytokines that increase when cows don't get sufficient rest. So there's maybe an inflammatory process that we'll come back to later in this talk. When cows are allowed to recover from restriction, from feeding and lying, they will prioritize restoring the lost resting time before the lost eating time, stressing how important that is to the cow. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about cow factors that impact resting behavior and external factors related to management and the environment that we keep the cow. So in cow factors, we're going to kick off and just talk about parity and stage of lactation. Well, studies frequently find that lying time tends to increase with advancing from calving, so with days in milk. And what we also understand is that young cows, primiparous or lactation 1 heifers, begin their lactations taking a greater number of shorter lying bouts and end their lactations behaving like older cows, which generally take fewer, longer lying bouts. So there's a little subtle difference in how cows get their resting behavior and get their lying time per day. And this is a highlight of what happens before and after calving. So here the cows are entering a maternity pen. This is the point of calving. And here we've got 3 lines. This is the decline in lying time that we see as calving approaches, going from about 13, 14 hours a day of rest in our dry cows to a nadir at the point of calving. A little bit of a recovery, and that's mainly driven by lame cows kind of recovering from calving, and then it stabilizes, but the lying time in lactation is generally a little lower than the lying time during the dry period. But what you can also see here is that cows increase the number of lying bouts per day. They get agitated, they get up and down more, but the duration of those lying bouts decreases. So we go from about 70 minutes as a lying bout duration down to a nadir about 35 minutes. So that's why the lying time decreases. It's a loss of lying bout duration. What about milk yield? This is another cow factor that impacts resting behavior. And here I'm going to crush a common myth. I hear this a lot. I read it all the time in the farming press. Cows make more milk when they lie down more. Well, we can go to the literature and find some reasons why that might be true. There's increased blood flow to the udder when the cow lies down. There's reduced circulating blood growth hormone levels when lying is restricted. Okay. And there was an older study done that reported this 3.5 pounds of milk per extra hour of rest. Well, let's go to the peer-reviewed literature. How many studies do we find where milk yield is positively related to lying time? That'd be none. What we instead find is that all the studies documenting this association find that high-producing dairy cows spend less time lying down than lower producing dairy cows. Shocker? Well, a little bit on an individual cow level. High producing cows spend less time lying down than their lower producing friends. What are they doing? they're eating more. It takes more time to eat more, and so these animals spend less time resting. That doesn't mean we design dairies to decrease lying times, but within individual cows, high-producing cows are busier and lie down less. What about illness and lameness? Well, these factors are also important. Sick cows, and we'll see a lot of attempts to use lying time data to identify sick cows. I'm really not that convinced of the modality of that when used in isolation. I like to say that those monitors are really good at identifying dead cows, but probably not really good at identifying subtly sick cows. I'd say in general, as you look at the literature, sick cows tend to increase the duration of each lying bout and spend more time lying down. There's a little bit of difference in regard to timing related to periparturient diseases for sure, as to whether that change in behavior is before or after calving. But in fact, when we look at cows with mastitis, the reverse is true. They actually spend less time lying down, and we believe that's likely related to the pain associated with mastitis and lying on a painful mammary gland. So the cows lie down less. So that's partly what makes it very tricky to use activity monitoring to identify sick cows. And then we've got the lame cow, which is a very special case because the response varies with severity, bedding surface, and the time the cow has available for rest. This is one of our older studies back in 2004 when I started this journey of looking at cow behavior. What we identified in mattress herds as we looked at non-lame, slightly lame, and moderately lame cows is an increase in standing behavior in the stalls, which in mattress stalls we saw a reduction in lying time. And in contrast, on sand stalls, those lame cows didn't show that alteration in behavior. They didn't stand more in the stall, and they actually lay down longer than their friends lying in mattress herds. And this really led to our hypothesis that it's really the difference between these different surfaces is the interaction between the claw and the bedding surface as the cow is getting up and down. Deep bedding allows and facilitates the cow to get up and down more easily to maintain normal patterns of rest. The point interaction here creates pain and difficulty for cows to change position, and that means cows get stuck on these harder surfaces. And these data kind of support that. One of the bedding surfaces that we see that doesn't provide cushion, traction, and support as cows get up and down is the waterbed. While it may provide cushion when the cow is lying on it, we do not see that same cushion as the cow changes from standing to lying. As a result, what do we see? We see very high rates of severe lameness in these bedded surfaces. This was a survey of 54 AMS units. And what do we see when we look at deep bedding, in this case, deep bedded sand? We see much lower rates of severe lameness and lower levels of lameness overall compared to mattresses and other types of surface. So when we look at the literature on lameness and resting behavior, it's a little bit complicated. There's consistency related to lying bout duration. 5 studies have found that lame cows increase the duration of lying bouts. There's somewhat consistency when it appears and is reported on the number of lying bouts per day. Lame cows take fewer lying bouts per day. It makes sense if it's painful to get up and down, that the cows are unlikely to do that as often. So fewer, longer lying bouts. But when we get to lying time, then it gets a little crazy. We've got 3 studies over here, 2 of which I contributed, had a negative impact on lying time. 2 were equivocal, no effect at all. But 9, the majority of studies have found that lying time increases in lame cows. So what's going on here? Well, actually, I think 2 things are happening. I said cows get stuck. Well, here we've got a frequency distribution of lame cows in the red and non-lame cows in the blue by lying time. And you can see the distribution is relatively normal for the non-lame cows, around 13 hours in this data set, but it's kind of skewed in the lame cow data set. We've got wings out here where we've got more lame cows lying for very long times, lame cows that are lying and can't stand up because they're stuck. And I can tell you it's very hard to eat for 4.5 hours a day or so and lie down for that amount of time and milk for 3 times. We're not going to get that done. So these are abnormal resting times. These aren't good. Equally, on the other end of this distribution, we've got more lame cows than non-lame cows out here with very short lying times. These were the cows that we saw standing in the stalls with those very high standing in stall data points. Lying times of 3, 5, 6, 7 hours a day are just simply not long enough. So I think that's what's happening with our lame cows. They get stuck. They get stuck lying down and they can't stand up, and they get stuck standing up and they can't lie down. So you see this weird skewed relationship. So it's bi-directional, which makes it very difficult to create an algorithm to use activity to identify lame cows. Again, the most consistent finding we see is an increase in the bout, the lying duration bout. So hopefully I haven't ruined your day too much by suggesting that there are cow level factors that influence resting behavior. Some of them are useful, some of them are confusing, but they're significant factors nonetheless. But there are some external factors, and we kind of threw a few of those in our discussion of lameness. So let's drill down a little bit more as we talk about resting space design and surface type. Well, we've argued for a number of years that a well-designed stall is sized appropriately to the size of the cows using them. If you have small stalls, then breed smaller cows. If you have bigger cows, then I think it behooves us to design those stalls around that animal. And we've got data now backing that up from Cassandra Tucker, from Laura Solano, Western study here. We see longer resting times in wider stalls and more lameness in stalls that are too narrow for the size of the cows using them. And our recommendations have been made available not only on our Dairyland Initiative website, but through Dairy Farm and many other sources. I think it bears discussion what hardware you should use to delineate the resting space. This comes down to divider loop design. And the bends and the placements of these pieces of metal, I think, are extremely important. We want to tell the cow just enough, but not too much, where to lie down to keep her clean. That means this lower bar needs to be level with the bedding surface and extend back from the brisket locator just enough to tell her where to lie down, so we keep that cow lying straight in the stall, generally about 20 to 22 inches from the brisket locator before we angle up. In these more complex loops, we'll see this drop down here to facilitate cows backing out of the stall and turning their heads. But the openness of the loop determines where that neck rail ends up, and the height of the lower rail determines whether that cow can lunge to the side or not. So we're going to typically, for mature lactating cows, black and white cows, put that height at 12 inches above the surface, leaving a 5-inch gap below the bar to make sure we don't get front feet trapped. That will, again, place the cow, not allow her to get her leg over the top of that bar and get trapped within the stall, but also facilitate diagonal lying, facilitate lunging to the side if the cow chooses to do so. And that's important when we talk about head-to-head stalls. Here we've got the neck rail up at the right location above the stall, typically around that 48 to 52 inches above the bedded surface, with the diameter of the loop generally in the range of 33 to 36 inches, depending on the size of the cow. So that's what the loop looks like in my world, leaving a 9 to 12 inch gap off the curb here to avoid injuring the loop with equipment, but also preventing cows from walking along the back of the stall. So here we're talking in an Artex meeting. This is an Artex loop, and I think they've got it done pretty well here. This is a recent adjustment. This is a double beam mounting system where they've raised the mounting beam above the level of the upper rail now, keeping this rail a little higher so that we can get good support, good structural integrity, but keeping that bar out of the way of the lunge. And you can see we've got a good extension, a level bar that prevents cows lunging into this front area here, sufficient height and expanse beyond the brisket locator to line the cows up. And when you put all this together, it looks just about right. Cows lie comfortably, nice and straight in the stall. They're clean. And you can see when the cow's standing in there, she sees this barrier as an obstruction, and that prevents her going underneath and getting stuck under the stall. But not everybody agrees. This was just a brief wander around a show in Finland. I was at the Skara show the last time I was able to travel, actually, in February. And I was appalled at the designs that I'm seeing in Europe. This was a loop that I have no idea what they're thinking about. This is a very common loop that we're seeing in Europe now with lots of bends. And you can see how the cows interact with these loops and these different areas, showing you that they're kind of in the way. This loop just amazes me. Why would you pay for someone to weld an extra green bit of bar on an existing bar when both of them are in the wrong place? And don't get me started on bendy neck rails. Moving beyond the design of the stall, deep bedding has proven to be best for our dairy cows. This is data from the largest survey of line time ever done by Laura Solano in Canada, 141 farms. Those bedded on sand averaged almost 12 hours a day, 11.7 hours of rest, 1 clear hour better than the majority of mattress and other type surfaces reported in that survey. So deep bedding delivered the goods on line time. But it also delivers the goods on hock injuries, and I'll take a brief aside there just to focus on this as a big welfare issue. We're auditing hock lesions, and so we want to make sure that we're preventing those. And you can see in the literature, deep bedding, especially with sand, reduces the risk for hock injuries. Well-maintained deep bedding is important, so the maintenance of that bed goes along with that. Increasing resting space length reduces risk of hock injury and decreased duration of housing period. And then most recently, some data presented from University of Guelph answering the question, how long does it take to heal a hock? Well, this is kind of fun to look at. Actually, most swollen hocks don't heal at all. They'll just stay swollen. But the hair loss recovers in about a month, about 30 days, when cows are moved to a favorable environment. And what I mean by that is soft bedding. They actually heal 6 times faster on sand and pasture and 3 times faster on a bedded pack compared to housing on a mattress surface. So if we're trying to reduce hock injuries when we're getting these animal welfare audits, deep bedding is an absolutely essential ingredient for that. What about other factors? The ability to access a resting space. And in our world, when we're talking about lactating dairy cows, we're really meaning the time in the pen and stocking density as we look at this. This is a recent survey, a meta-analysis of all the line time studies looking at the impact of stocking density. And this is looking at the stocking density ratio of cows to stalls. So as we go from 1 to 1.5 to 2, we can see the impact on line time. And this is the reduction as a percentage reduction in line time from 1 to 1, from a ratio of 1 cow per stall. So what this line tells you, and you can see how consistent these studies have been over the years since the mid to late 70s, that we lose about 15% of our line time as we go from 1 to 1.5 cows per stall. Put that in numbers, if we're shooting for 12 hours of rest per day, we can argue whether we are or not, but that 15% reduction just from overstocking at 1.5 cows per stall will take us to 10.2 hours a day, just from overstocking. Really only one study converting that stocking density data into milk production. This is what farmers always want to see. Well, this is Alex Bach's work from 47 herds in Spain, fed a common ration but stocking in their dairies at different rates. And again, if you look at this line, and you see some variation around here, but the R squared here is nearly 30%. So stocking density is explaining 30% of the variation in milk yield. So it's a pretty big deal. And what this means is, as we go from 1 to 1.5 cows per stall, we reduce milk yield by about 5 to 8 pounds per cow per day. So we're going to lose 5 to 8 pounds of milk from stocking from 1 cow per stall as we move to 1.5 cows per stall. So don't be under any illusions. Stocking density impacts resting behavior. It will impact milk production. When we look at lying time relative to time milking, way back in 2010 here, our data would suggest that we've got to get milking done in about 3 hours or less to preserve about 12 hours a day of resting behavior. And this is by whether you are lame or not. As you increase time spent milking, you decrease time spent lying. Milking times are not random. This was 15 cows that we filmed over 4 separate occasions, and you can see their time milking per day presented here. There are cows that spend longer milking per day very consistently over these 4 separate occasions, compared to some cows over those 4 different occasions that spend much less time milking. These cows are averaging about 1.5 hours a day for 3x milking. These cows are averaging 3 or maybe a little more. On average, overall in this herd, the average cow spent 2.3 hours a day milking, actual milking time. We don't see that reported very much, so we often see time away from the pen being reported, which is kind of the worst case scenario. So what this Canadian data shows is that we really don't see lying times in excess of 12 hours a day if we exceed 1 cow per stall. So that quadrant is empty. And over here, very few herds averaging 12 hours a day or more when we exceed about 3 to 3.5 hours a day milking time out of the pen. So again, setting thresholds, I'm still going to claim that we should reduce our stocking to 1 cow per stall, and we should limit our time out of the pen to 3 hours a day to optimize resting behavior. I've been recently interested in what's going on in robotic dairies, and we hear a lot about the advantages of robotic milking, that cows can create their own timelines and do whatever they want and milk at different times and take away the stresses of being in a holding area. Well, what we did was we went to a free flow traffic system and we created a waiting area. We just drew a line around the fetch area here and a line from the middle of the robot. And we said, okay, a cow enters here, she's waiting. And so we monitored that continuously with continuous video recording. And we compared that data with a herd that uses guided flow. And you can see a typical Delaval guided flow system here. Cow goes into the commitment pen. She has to go into the robot to escape. So this is, again, Laura Solano spent the summer with us and created these data for us. This is the guided flow herd. On average, the cows waited to be milked for 1.5 hours a day. Pretty good, not compared to those some of those conventional herds. That looks good, but when we look at the individual data, we go from cows that barely wait at all, they just fly into the robot whenever they feel like it, to cows that waited 7, nearly 8 hours a day. So the danger here is the tail. There are cows spending significantly long times waiting to enter the robot. A danger of cows entering the commitment pen, getting bullied and not being able to get out of that area. And so it's reliant upon the herd owner to identify those cows, have an alert system set up so that they can get them into the robot and get them out of that pen. So maybe that was one of the disadvantages we saw of guided flow, but overall, okay, not terrible. But compared to conventional herds, remember, conventional herds, there is a finite time where the last cow in the pen goes through the parlor. In robotic herds, there does not appear to be an endpoint. And that was true, surprisingly true, in our free flow robot dairy. Again, these are just single farms, but we averaged an identical 1.5 hours a day waiting to be milked in an AMS unit. It was the same as a guided flow, a little better than conventional herds, but the same as guided flow. The variation was enormous again, 2 minutes to over 5.5 hours. So again, we've got a long tail here of cows that are waiting to use the robot. And that's the interesting thing, is to look at what's going on out here in this tail, because in a free flow system, you have no alerts. You do not know what's happening to these animals. They're not triggering anything. They're not entering a gate, so you don't know they're there. And what we found was happening in this free flow AMS unit. The fresh heifers were housed in a mixed parity group with older cows. And we had very long line times, waiting times in those first lactation animals, especially in early days in milk, over 2 hours of waiting there on average. So that's really the challenge for our robotic dairies, is to protect these first lactation animals who are trying to work out how to use this robot and make sure that bully cows can't push these animals out of the way. And this is one adaptation that we really like. It protects the waiting cow and prevents bully cows from interacting with the shoulder area of this waiting cow. This is a little video that we obtained. This is from our friends in Finland from 4D Barn. This was one of their audits, and you can see this big old white bully cow trying to move this cow waiting, but that shield there prevents that animal moving her out of the way. You can see she's trying her best to get it an access to the robot and move that animal out of the way. I guarantee if that shield was not there, that cow would have moved her. Final external factor, thermal microenvironment. What are we talking about there? Well, there are behavioral consequences of heat stress. We often talk about the physiological consequences, but there are behavioral consequences of heat stress. We lose line time as it gets hotter. Line time impact about 3 hours a day over the typical range of temperatures that we see, consistent over numerous studies. What's happening here, and we're following a group of cows over a 6-day heat stress spike, line time decreases by 3.5 hours a day. Why? Because the duration of the lying bout decreases. Okay, they have the same number of bouts per day, about 12, but their duration of each lying bout decreases from about 50 minutes in these data to 30 minutes. That's why we lose line time. And what's happening here is that cows are accumulating heat when they're lying down. So when they lie down, they warm. They accumulate heat at about 1 degree Fahrenheit or 0.5 degree centigrade per hour. When they stand, they tend to cool, but only at half the rate. So cows cool when they stand, they accumulate heat when they rest. So during that resting bout, cows reach a tipping point. Their temperature increases by about 0.5 degree centigrade, and they have to stand to cool. And that's what drives that change in behavior. What we also see as a behavioral reaction when cows are heat stressed is this frustrating bunching reaction here. Cows are in essence still grazing animals. They're hardwired to go and seek dark areas. When we put them in a barn and it's hot, guess what? They go away from the side walls, away from the end walls, and they commingle in the middle of the barn where it's darker. Drives everybody nuts, but that's bunching behavior for you. It's a sign of heat stress. Can be indicative of fly worry as well, but predominantly a sign of heat stress. We hear a lot about use of water, soaker systems to reduce the impact of heat stress, and they do indeed. They reduce body temperatures, they improve feed intakes, and they improve milk yield. However, they do not impact line time. So soaker systems compared to control systems during the summer have had very little impact on line time. So if we're trying to improve our resting times during the summer, we've got to look beyond the use of feed line water soaking cooling systems. And really what we've settled on is focusing on the thermal microenvironment that occurs within the stall, within the pen, within the barn, and remind ourselves that whatever ventilation system that we're designing has to impact the immediate environment around where the cow is lying down. And that's why we're very much focused on air speeds and overlapping fan patterns, visualizing airflow, realizing that in the majority of our barns, we've put fans above stalls very commonly, but we've generally spaced them too far apart. And so typical fan spacings of 24 to 30 feet are more effective at layering that fast moving air in the resting space than when we space these fans further apart at over 30 feet or even 48 feet in many barns. And so the mistake we've made over the years is not angling these fans down steep enough and spacing them a little too far apart to achieve what we view as the minimum cooling airspeed of about 200 feet per minute. So MCAS, it's not the thing that crashes Boeing airplanes, it's minimum cooling airspeed. And a review of the literature done by our good colleague, Mario Mandaka, showed us that the minimum in the resting area should be 200 feet per minute or 2.25 miles an hour. And his research review really suggested a reduction in benefit. So very little benefit once we start to exceed 400 feet per minute or 4.5 miles an hour. And we're seeing at the time when we did this lit review, speeds being forecast in excess of this in many of the barns we were seeing. So this summer, we did an experiment. This is Jennifer Van Oss's work with our PhD student, Kim Reuscher, set up this system with 2 fans above the resting area, groups of cows moving in with different airspeed treatments. So we put the fans on at high speed, low speed, and no speed in a naturally ventilated barn. And this is just a picture Kim took when the fans were off. This was the changeover in the study. So they were off at this point. You can see there are some cows lying down here, but most of the cows are sort of gathering here, trying to get a little bit of air movement from somewhere else. We've got waters up here too. She turned the fans on, and within a few minutes, this is what the cows do. They go and lie down. And that's what we saw. These are very preliminary data, just to give you an idea of what we're seeing here. But basically still air, we saw about 10.8 hours of rest per day. We got the airspeed up on average around 330 feet per minute. We got to 11.4 hours a day, and very little improvement as we increased speed above that to 455 feet per minute. So this was the high speed treatment, little bit of an increase, but very incremental compared to the big increase that we saw when we moved from still air to that 330 feet per minute. So we're looking at these data currently, more to come from this study, but it's really supporting what we've been talking about, those minimum cooling air speeds. And that knowledge of improving resting times by imposing fast moving air in the lying space has driven our changes and enhancements to ventilation systems. You saw one of those wonderful systems in the video at the start of this talk, but also in cross-ventilated barns with baffles being used to drive airspeed into the cow resting environment. So those are the factors that influence resting behavior. Optimal cow comfort is not always associated with longer resting times. If you started off the talk thinking that, you're wrong. And I'm sorry about that, but that's the reality. If we go to some farms that have very long resting times, that might not be a good thing. You may have lots of sick and lame cows in that herd. Equally, if we go to a very healthy herd with very high producing cows, those cows are busy and they may not lie down as long as you expect. These factors all interact to drive this resting behavior. So what I want to leave you with is a knowledge of optimal resting behavior. Cows resting when they need to for as long as they wish to. That is an important concept. It's not just increased lying time. How does this impact longevity? Let's try and tackle that one. Well, if we look at the population of cows leaving our herd, the most common problems we identify are thin cows, cows with poor udder health, and lame cows. And obviously, lameness influences body condition, milk production, fertility, health, and of course, longevity. And so, what I'm trying to do here is explain what cow comfort is. And I think it largely relates back to control of lameness. We look at a number of studies here looking at the association between lying behavior and lameness. Now, this is looking at what happens prior to the lameness. Does cow comfort prevent lameness? It's actually a really difficult study to do. And there's really only been 3 studies to show this that have been done well enough over the years, even just in the last 10 years. Proudfoot study, this study on pastured cattle, and most recently, my friend Gerard Kramer did a really nice study here using their facility looking at Jersey cows. All 3 studies confirm that if we increase lying time in the immediate postpartum and early lactation period, we decrease the risk of lameness later on. These are key studies. With that knowledge, with an improvement in barn improvements that improve lying times, we see reduction in lameness coupled with those changes. So it gives us hope that by enhancing optimal behavior, by allowing cows to rest when they need to, that we can prevent lameness. What the mechanism for this is likely mediated through inflammation. And I showed you earlier, when we prevent cows lying down, that the inflammatory markers can increase. And we know in humans that people that spend time in jobs where they have to stand for a protracted period of time suffer more plantar fasciitis. And although the anatomy is different in the cow, you can see the consequences of inflammation below the pedal bone here, these changes to the bony structure of the claw, which are completely permanent and put that cow at risk of sole hemorrhage and ulcer again and again and again as she goes through her life. So cow comfort has several roles to play when we look at lameness. I think we've got compelling data now that low lying times coupled with poor trimming and hoof overload can contribute to cows getting lame, predominantly from ulcers and hemorrhage, some white lines. But also we know from those individual cow factors that once cows are lame, they change their behavior. They have very long and very short lying times, and coupled with poor treatment, poor detection and successful treatment, those animals can stay lame for protracted periods of time. So this is the get lame, stay lame hypothesis, and there are dual roles for cow comfort at each of these steps based on preventing lameness, but also the alterations in behavior that occur once a cow becomes lame. Getting back to data from farms, this was a cluster analysis of a large number of dairies in Wisconsin, looking at clustering these herds by like performance characteristics over 16 different variables. What I wanted just to demonstrate here and focus on the high production groups here, group 1 and 2. And you can see actually when we look at culling rates, they're all over the board and not particularly sensitive to whether cows are producing high or low production. But I want to focus on what these groups do to achieve this very high production with reasonably low levels of culling and good longevity. Well, they have deep bedded stalls, headlocks at the feed bunk. They have solid floors. We don't see a lot of slatted floors and manual alleyway removal of manure. They don't tend to use lots of rubber flooring in the freestall alleys. They'll use that in transfer lanes and around the milking parlor, but they do have fans over the resting area. We've worked on adapting that and improving that over time. They do have feed line soakers very commonly, but they trim cows very frequently, the vast majority at least once per lactation and many twice a lactation, and they foot bath at least 4 times a week on average. With that combination of strategies, we see less than 13% overall lameness prevalence in these high producing herds, averaging 90 plus pounds of milk. So lameness and injury related to type of bedding surface, to relate that back, We see lower levels of lameness. We see much lower levels of hock injury and knee injury with deep bedding compared to mattress herds in these data, explaining some of that excellent performance we see in those group 1 and group 2 herds. And these data from Pam Roog's work confirming that turns into milk. We see our herds, 60% of Wisconsin herds on sand bedding, producing 2,000 pounds of milk or so more than those using manure solids and organic bedding over mats and mattresses, and at the same time having better udder health, lower somatic cell counts. So it does make sense, and it does impact longevity and health. So what does optimal resting behavior look like then? So I've given you a word of warning that it's not just about longer is better. Well, as you look at the average time budget, as we piece this together from over 200 cows in 16 different freestall barns, this is what we put together as our target. About 4.5 hours of eating a TMR, about 3 hours out of the pen milking. And again, in robotic dairies, we can maintain the majority of cows less than that, but we have to guard against some of the outlier cows being much more than that compared to a conventional herd. We're allowing about 2 hours a day standing in the stall. We can get that a little lower with really good stall design, but cows need to socialize. They spend about half an hour near a waterer and about 2 hours in the alley, for a total of about 2.5 hours a day in the alleyways wandering around, which leaves you 12 hours for rest. So this is the hypothetical time budget. Then what do we see in our dairy herds? Well, this is over 450 farms from a number of different studies using mostly these hobo data loggers to measure line time. Our study way back in 2010 was done before those were widely available. That was done by video. So I did a lot of the video watching, and I can tell you that's what we saw. But here's the line time. Okay, mean herd line time. It's a bit disappointing. Overall, we're averaging 11.1 hours a day. We can see groups of herds averaging only just over 10 hours a day, and that simply isn't good enough. We see other herds up around that 12, 11.9 hours a day on average. They typically take about 10 lying bouts per day. I think the data loggers missed some. When we watched cows, it was closer to 12 or 13. And the average duration of each lying bout tends to average out at around 1.2 hours. So the average cow lies down 10 times a day for each time, an average of 1.2 hours, and achieves an overall line time of 11.1 hours a day. I'm going to say we've got to do better than that. I think we've got to head upwards towards this higher level by addressing some of the issues that I've discussed in this talk. And I think we can do that. We've proved we can do that. So based upon having healthy, non-lame cows with deep-bedded, comfortable free stalls that are well designed, TMR fed, making sure that the cows are within the pen 21 or more hours a day, stocking at 1 cow per stall with a favorable resting area microenvironment, layering that fast-moving air with the use of fans or baffles to redirect that air into the resting space. I believe we can see mean line times for herds in this range of around 11.5 to 12.5 hours a day. And that's a little lower perhaps than numbers that you've heard of before, 13, 14 hours a day. We see dry cows lying down that long, but we don't see high-performing, high production herds averaging those kinds of numbers. So we've got to reduce our expectations a little bit, I think, in terms of the overall averages that we're seeing. This is the range I'd like to live within here, 11.5 to 12.5, with average lying bout durations of about 1.2 hours. So with this recipe for success, I think we can do that. We can optimize resting behavior, again, to allow cows to rest when they want to, for as long as they need to, and achieve high production and low levels of lameness and enhanced longevity. I want to thank the sponsors that assist us with our Dairyland Initiative, invite you to visit our website at the Dairyland Initiative.vetmed.wis.edu. We've got some workshops on ventilation and AMS unit design coming up in early December. So we'd invite you to visit the website and see if you're free. We'd love to have you for that. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Perfect. We have quite a few, so thank you very much. The first question is, what is the view on the new green plastic sticks and the ones that are two pieces rather than a loop?
The view on the green plastic sticks, I think you've said it well. They're green plastic sticks. They do not follow any plan for a divider loop that I talked about here. That slanted lower bar allows cows to diagonally lie in the stall. They like to lunge over the low point and park their bums under the bar. They really don't position the cow well to keep her clean. I will say with deep bedding, they're comfortable because cows generally can kind of ignore them. But the issue with them really is one of hygiene and trying to position the cow correctly.
Could you please explain your comment? Don't get me started on bent shoulder bars.
On the bendy neck rails?
Yes.
Yeah, bendy neck rails have been out, seen a lot in Canada, some in Europe. I think they're meant to keep the cow straight in the stall when they're standing. I like deep bedding. The issue with them when we use them with deep bedding is that we really struggle to place the cow relative to the rear curb. We actually need cows to step out of the stall with deep bedding. And you really struggle to do that with bendy neck rails. You can't generally position them in a place where that can happen. And neck rails have not been shown to influence lying position very much. So I'm not completely convinced that they influence the position that the cow lies down in when they're used. And so, bending, uses money. So I'm not sure I'm kind of tight at heart. So I think I'll stick with a straight rail.
Another question on the bent rails. Would you have a neck rail in the wrong position? When you have a neck rail in the wrong position and moving it would reduce the structural integrity of the cubicle, would you consider a bendy neck rail?
That's a good one. So now we're into compromise. Potentially, if we're dealing with an older divider loop that's more narrow, where we have to lower that lower bar down to about 12 inches, that means the neck rail is very low. You could certainly retrofit with a bendy neck rail on that one and elevate the height of the neck rail at that point. If that's going to work, you've got to make sure you've got front lunge space. Because ultimately, if you're on a short platform, short head-to-head platform, the cows are going to diagonal lunge. And when they diagonal lunge, the effective neck rail is still the upper edge of the divider loop. So if that's still too low, which the bendy neck rail doesn't fix, then I think you're still in a compromised situation. So maybe if you can provide them front lunge.
Are people really at 1.5 cows per stall? I thought 120% was the maximum.
Oh, this is the Wild West. We've gone through a significant stress period in the U.S. dairy industry. You will find herds at 1.5 cows per stall or more than that pretty commonly. It's not audited as such in many welfare audits. Those audits are predominantly focused on outcome, which I believe is the right thing to do. Focused on, again, hocks and lesions and injuries and lameness. But no, we'll see high stocking rates in many of our farms. Less so in Europe, and there are certain rules that the folks follow more related to stocking density there. But when it's unregulated, we'll see some overstocking examples that are can be fairly ugly.
Does stocking density affect production only because of line time, or is it because you are also limiting feed space, water space, etc.? Have any studies just looked at stall space per cow while holding feed space the same?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really complicated answer because what tends to happen, obviously, in most real world situations, when you overstock the stalls, you reduce bunk space. When studies have been done to try to look at each of those separately, there are interactions for sure. And it's probably a combination of things that result in the decreased milk production. When we limit feed space, cows can alter their behavior. They can have fewer visits to the bunk and eat faster. And some animals may be able to compensate for that quite well, but there will be others that don't. Cows don't have that ability to adapt their lying behavior. They can't lie down faster at a faster rate. So it's an interesting change in behavior. I'll say it's a sum of both of those effects, but both are important. It's not just feed space.
What about humidity and the effect on speeds greater than 2 minutes per second or 2 meters per second?
The effect of humidity?
Yes.
I think there is obviously a heat stress effect of humidity, and we try to deal with that in our calculation of THI, the temperature humidity index. It certainly worsens the situation. I don't know that we fully understand the impact of airspeed on humidity. I don't think those studies have done. I think we've got a ton of data out of our study this summer that we may be able to look at that. I would expect airspeed to be effective over a range of humidities, but perhaps at high humidities, the effectiveness decreases. Just not sure.
What angle do you suggest for fans over freestalls?
I don't have an angle. What I'll tell you is to space the fans according to the fan airspeed recommendations and throw distances that the manufacturers have. And usually we're just doing the old-fashioned test of lying in a stall with a anemometer and checking airspeeds. And what you want to do is overlap the airspeeds. And so what you do with the fans is when you space them and you work out what spacing you're going for, you angle the fan below the fan in front. And so that's the angle. You tilt them so that the air hits the point below the next fan.
In hot, humid climates, do you believe 2 meters per second is the target or faster? On this person's farm, they've added more fans, spacing them closer together, and they're seeing increase of 4 to 6 liters per cow per day. The relative humidity is now having very little impact on milk production in this barn compared to previous years.
Great analysis. Again, not been done in peer review or experimentally to support that. The available data has been done over a range of temperatures and humidities. Not looking at humidity precisely doesn't support going much above 400 feet per minute. If you're seeing extra benefits of that, great. I just don't have any science to back that up.
Do different ventilation systems like adjustable louver fans, panel fans, and helicopter fans, along with different bedding materials, have an effect on laying time and lateness?
All of the different types of fans will influence airspeed. And so the focus we've had on the change in behavior relates to airspeed. So helicopter fans use large volumes of air, but tend not to create fast enough air close to where we need it, but are useful in certain situations like compost barns and bedded packs, where we can distribute that air more evenly because there are fewer barriers. Don't particularly favor them for free stalls where the air is kind of hitting cows and divider loops and things and slowing down too rapidly. Louvers, not totally convinced that they add very much to redirect air. They're just very big fans most of the time, and they move lots of air and they move it very fast and for longer distances than smaller fans. So I'd focus on the output rather than the type of fan. What's the airspeed where the cows are?
We've already touched on the curved shoulder bars. There's quite a few questions about those. There is someone who's wondering if we can get a copy of the presentation to send out, which we'll ask if you can send
Yeah,
that.
I can forward that to you, and you can distribute as you see fit.
Excellent. So is ventilating above the individual stalls more preferable than providing fresh air via ventilators, taking fresh air in?
If it's just asking about recirculation of air and versus fresh air, it's a really good point. There is an impact of airspeed. There is an impact of exhausting hot air out of the barn. And so I think effective heat stress abatement, if we move to that point, is both of those things. You don't get a reduction in heat stress if you just move hot air around within the barn all the time. So that airspeed has to be coupled with good exhaust. And again, go back to that first amazing video of that new dairy. You've got what looks like a tunnel, potentially a hybrid system. I saw tube systems there for the winter, cupola systems, very much focused on making sure we've got good exhaust year round, much more in the summer, less in the winter, obviously. But you've got to exhaust that heat and moisture out of the barn. That is really important. That's why those newer designs achieve that goal. And those types of tunnel systems do it very well. But you've got to couple it with air movement within the resting area. So it's kind of a combination of both of those things are important.
So there's a question here that's talking about the large tube systems over stalls, but do you also recommend them in the collecting yard?
Yeah, I use favor those positive pressure tube systems. We obviously got tons of experience of them in calf barns that you can kind of see down here. These are all fitted with positive pressure tubes. We've used them in freestall barns in what I call dungeon barns. And I spend time in Europe. You'll go to Holland, Germany, the UK, closed in barns with solid walls. Bringing fresh air from the outside is an absolute premium. And they love them because they don't use fans that use a hell of a lot of electricity. And in Europe, electricity is more expensive than it is here. So when you can bring fast moving air through a tube system from the outside into those dungeon barns that are so sealed up that don't have very much airflow through, they can be enormously useful. But it is a challenge to get the air speeds that we need with those systems over a prolonged distance. And so I generally confine them for smaller dry cow sheds and things like that. I think there's a supplemental system they can work. I generally don't favor them for new facilities where we can focus on exhaust in other different ways and have a more open barn with higher sidewalls and so on if we're focused on natural ventilation. Do we use them in holding areas? We've got maybe half a dozen. Some folks like them, some don't. I think by now, if it was a highly successful idea, we'd see more farms with them. Certainly can visit farms that are doing a really good job. But again, it's a lot of retrofits that it's been very difficult to get good airflow, and we can go in with positive pressure tubes and be very successful with that. Generally haven't seen them in a lot of new facilities.
So we have time for one more question, and this will be, what will the innovations around barn equipment be in the coming decade, or do you think it's outdeveloped?
What are the innovations in barn equipment? That's a really good question. I believe we've fixed stalls. I don't see them changing very much. I haven't changed very much in my recommendations for 10 years. Cows still seem to be doing very well in what we've been talking about for that period of time. I think manure, sand separation innovations are progressing. The most exciting thing, although we missed World Dairy Expo this year, the prior Dairy Expo, there was a sand separator that was suitable for small herds, for smaller 300 to 500 cow dairies. Whereas before we really only saw those types of systems in 1,000 cow plus dairies. So I'm excited about innovations with manure handling, of improvements in sand separation that can be used on smaller farms. I think those are critical for me to improve cow comfort. I think we've got some tweaks to make with ventilation design. Good questions about the role of humidity and whether we should have faster air in the higher humid conditions. I don't know, maybe, and we can certainly try to answer those questions. So I think there's some innovations there. We're thinking of different ways of playing with positive pressure ventilation systems in some barns that I think will come along the line. And then a lot of our focus has been on AMS units. You know, we've got this amazing technology that can milk cows without milkers. How do we best adapt the barn around the cow and the robot unit? I don't think we've completely solved all of the potential issues there. And I showed you an example of the waiting time issues that we've been able to show in both guided flow and free flow systems, and trying to build ways to limit and prevent those problems. That certainly will be our focus over the next few years.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I think I can speak for everyone that this was a really great presentation. We've had a lot of questions. I might send a few your way.
Sounds good. Great questions, by the way. Thanks for chiming in.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.